If there's one thing that we're proud of as human beings, it's our rationality. We believe that our rationality, our ability to reason, is what divides us from the savage chaos of the animal world. In fact, we are so confident in our rationality that the field of economics essentially presumes that our society is filled not merely with Homo sapiens, but rather Homo economicus, the ultra-rational, incentive-driven profit seekers. We believe that if we attack any problem with enough rationality, we can solve it. The psychology, then, behind the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa provides quite the conundrum for such economists. HIV/AIDS is a disease that has ravaged the continent and only continues to spread. But development wisdom tells us that once Africans are fully educated about the dangers of HIV, the incentive of avoiding this terrible disease and ultimately death should be sufficient for behavioral change. In the shadow of the deadliest epidemic in the modern era, those having sex with multiple partners, or not using protection, should have more than enough reason to adapt to a world with HIV and stay healthy. After all, we say to ourselves, what greater incentive is there than life itself? Well, it turns out that it's not so simple. Of course, there are many who fall neatly into this model and take up the desired preventative measures. But what HIV programs have been increasingly running into are groups of people that simply don't fit this so-called rational model. People who continue to have multiple partners that are HIV positive, or people who refuse treatment once they do contract HIV. We place these people on the fringes and tell ourselves that there is something very wrong with them. This particular Western prejudice is well expressed by Stephanie Nolan, a South African HIV/AIDS author. As she puts it, they feel a dying African is somehow different from a dying Canadian, American, or German. That Africans have lower expectations or place less value on their lives. It's so easy to believe this subconsciously, even if no one says it aloud, because it doesn't require us to question our assumptions about why AIDS prevention fails, and to delve deeper into how the incentives of a rational American might be worlds away from those of a rational African. One example of these outliers is African truck drivers, some of the most vilified spreaders of HIV due to their widespread mobility, the prevalence of roadside brothels, and a brutally monotonous workday. Even after the start of the pandemic, truckers are notorious for showing no change in their large number of partners. Muhammad Ali is one such truck driver from Kenya. Defying all logic and basic mathematics, he claimed to have slept with 100,000 women, more or less. In the midst of a worldwide HIV pandemic, the natural response would be to say, he must be out of his mind. Indeed, Muhammad is HIV positive. But he is no fool, and he is well acquainted with the prevalence and the dangers of HIV. Why the risk then? When asked about his reaction to his diagnosis, he said, I took it very easily, because I am a truck driver and I could die at any time. You hear the same from men in the military and in mining, jobs with very high mortality. The fact is, avoiding HIV/AIDS is a long-term health investment, not unlike going to the gym or quitting smoking. Studies of sexual behavior change in various African countries have shown something similar. In countries where people have lower life expectancies due to malaria or maternal mortality, sexual behavior shows little to no change after HIV education. In other African countries where life expectancy is higher, sexual behavior changes drastically. Because a higher life expectancy gives people more motivation to avoid the long-term detriments of HIV/AIDS. But compared to the everyday killers of poverty, disease, or a dangerous job, a virus that takes years to kill is not the powerful disincentive that we may assume it is. In that respect, people like Muhammad who show no behavior change in the midst of HIV/AIDS aren't being suicidally irrational, but actually quite rational, at least when it comes to their own self-interests. Of course, such behavior is irresponsible and endangers many other lives. But writing truckers off as reckless and selfish doesn't solve anything. We must consider that they operate under different circumstances in a different lifestyle, and that their decisions are as rational as any other human beings. Another question that tortures the minds of Western developers is, why do some Africans refuse HIV medication? To give an absolute, generalizing answer to this or any question regarding all Africans would be falling into the same trap that we're trying to avoid. But the following examples are only included to prove that everyone operates under unique values and individual circumstances. Winston Zulu, an HIV/AIDS activist who set up support groups in Zambia, found that in many cases, having AIDS was a blessing in disguise. Anyone with full-blown AIDS can go to the government and request a disability grant, so that a needy mother, for example, can support her family. For such mothers, taking medication and getting better would lose her the grant money that feeds her children. In these cases, patients ultimately have to decide between money and health. Often, this money is the only thing sustaining families and putting food on the table. For others who refuse medication, distrust of Western medicine has roots in countries that were once oppressed and wrung dry of their resources by Western colonialism. Medicine was a vital ingredient to white political power, and has never had a neutral connotation in colonial history. When Doctors Without Borders came to rural Transkei in South Africa, many residents believed that these doctors came with the HIV virus in their very needles, hoping to infect and subjugate Africa. And based on Africa's tragic history, who can blame them for believing this? On a more general note, why do some Africans avoid seeking any help at all for HIV? Perhaps the most significant reason is one that many observers have inextricably connected to the AIDS pandemic: stigma. As Stephanie Nolan writes in her book 28 Stories of AIDS in Africa, stigma is not, of course, unique to HIV. It is a common feature of incurable, transmissible, and deadly illnesses. But there is a particular distaste save for those diseases where the sick are viewed as the authors of their own misfortune, and a particular shame that comes with a disease most often transmitted by sex. Priska Malolo, an AIDS activist in Zimbabwe, forever bears the scars of such stigmas. As soon as she told her family that she was HIV positive, she was struck on the forehead with a bottle and on the back of the neck with a bench, by her own siblings. In our culture, she reflected, you don't tell. We don't talk, and that is killing the nation. Fighting stigma is not so easy as encouraging honesty and openness. Stigma is often a defense mechanism, a fence that is erected around the sick to affirm the health of the healthy. People cling to such mechanisms because they're the only way to survive seeing death all around them. And the openness that is in our eyes a powerful tool to combat AIDS is in another's eyes a guarantee for social excommunication and hatred. If love and social acceptance are some of the strongest incentives out there for human beings, then hatred and social isolation are certainly some of the strongest deterrents. If there's one thing to understand about Africa through these stories, it's the fact that you can't understand Africa. Africa is a continent of 54 countries, all with different cultures, lifestyles, and social pressures. In the face of such complexity, it's far too easy to rely on our behavioral models and divide the victims of HIV/AIDS into those who fit our models and those who don't, into those we can heal and those we condemn. As soon as we consider any sort of behavior irrational and self-destructive, we allow ourselves to take comfort in the fact that our inability to help these people is due to their own flaws, rather than the flaws of our programs. Instead, each of these outliers, the truck driver who won't stop having sex, the mother who refuses treatment, and the advocate scorned by her family, represents a limitation to our programs, and a need to broaden our ideas of what constitutes rational decision-making. Anything less is simply an injustice to the millions of people who suffer from HIV/AIDS and who need their voices heard.